Welcome to the ParentNet podcast by Focus on the Family Singapore. In each episode, we'll be speaking with everyday parents and practitioners as they share with us gems from their parenthood journey. Keep tuning in to learn with us as we figure it out together.
Hello and welcome to the ParentNet podcast. My name is June and I'm your host for this episode. As a parent, having a child with learning difficulties can feel overwhelming and unfamiliar. Many may experience a mix of emotions and may not know where to go to next. What are some of the warning signs that parents should be aware of, and where do we begin seeking help? That's what we will cover in today's episode. Joining me on this podcast is Dawn Tan, an educational therapist with more than 10 years of experience helping children with learning difficulties. Welcome to the ParentNet podcast, Dawn. Thank you for joining us today. Would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Thank you, June. Thanks for having me here today. Hi, everyone. I'm Dawn. My husband and I have been married for almost 12 years. We have 3 lovely girls, aged 7, 5, and 4. I've been an educational therapist for about 12 and a half years now. I work with learners aged 5 to 18 on literacy and language-related needs. For example, the difficulties with reading, writing, and language comprehension. I also support their parents in navigating some of these challenges.
Thanks for giving us that overview of how you've been working with parents, helping their children. And age 5 to 18, that's quite a big gap, I notice. I'm just wondering, what are some early signs that parents can look out for that might indicate a child has some difficulty with literacy or language?
If your child has had a speech and language delay, I would say keep monitoring. Keep a lookout, even though your child has started to speak, say at age 3 or 4, and you think that, thankfully, he has started to speak. But I would say continue to keep monitoring. Sometimes the child might continue to have difficulties with phonological processing, which is the processing of sounds of our language. By the time the child is about 5 or 6, you can spot some red flags. Look out for difficulties in dealing with letters and sounds. For example, difficulties with remembering sounds of the alphabet, identifying rhymes, remembering the letters of the alphabet, difficulties with pronouncing or articulating common monosyllabic words. Sometimes they might even flip the sounds or syllables. For example, delicious, they will pronounce it as dishilous, and spot, they end up reading as stop or pronouncing it as stop, pat as tap. Yeah, so they flip sounds, they flip syllables, and we want to look out for persistent difficulties with these. Okay, sometimes, as for young children, they are still new to our language, relatively new, they're gaining mastery. It's quite normal and typical for them to encounter such difficulties. In fact, we might find it quite cute, right? But once they reach about 6 years old, 7 years old, we should see them gain better control of their speech. So if we see persistent difficulties with word and text skills as well, such as tedious blending and segmenting of words, and frequently making mistakes with them, we also want to be very mindful of that. And I'm talking about persistent difficulties. At the start, definitely they are going to spend some time trying to blend and trying to segment words, break words up and all. But if the difficulties you find is persistent, after a long time of trying to teach them and they don't seem to be picking up, then that's where you might want to look for some intervention.
So you mentioned intervention. Where do you think is a good place to start for parents?
I would say speak to a professional in the field of early education or learning difficulties. Speak to your child's preschool teacher to see if observations and concerns align. And you may also want to speak with an educational psychologist, educational therapist, pediatric speech and language therapist, as well as occupational therapists to find out more about what can be done. Because we do a lot of internal referrals. So if we find that a child is more suitable for another service, we would recommend that. And you might experience a bit of back and forth communication until you find the right fit. But that's okay because sometimes parents feel lost and they just need a starting point. I also want to highlight that we should look out for avoidant or masking behaviors because some children are so aware when something is difficult and they don't want to appear incompetent. So they find ways to compensate or mask their difficulties. For example, memorizing certain books and only wanting to read those books. I've had parents who told me that they were just not aware that their child could not read because of this. Right. The child could actually read a book word for word and they memorize the entire thing. So of course, these compensating strategies help the child conceal their difficulties to a certain point. But when difficulty level of tasks or workload increase, you would start to see cracks appear.
It sounds like even the child would begin to hide the difficulties that they are facing and experiencing. So it definitely sounds like there's some fear, there's some worry in their young minds even.
Yeah.
So what more for parents and carers who are taking care of these children, right? I can imagine how on the one hand you have this feeling like something might be up, something might be, your child might be struggling with this. On the other, you're like, maybe it's just a passing phase. Maybe if we work at it hard enough, it will pass. So there is some emotional tussle definitely going on in the parent's heart and mind. So I'm just wondering, as an educational therapist, how do you work with them to, first of all, accept that this is a journey your child is on, and then to navigate this process of growing with their children?
I think as much as we see gaps in reading ability, we also want to be mindful that every learner, every child has their strengths as well. And as we highlight their strengths and address their needs, we want parents to see hope in every situation and recognize that every child, when given the right support and environment, can make good progress and experience success. So we communicate frequently with parents to help them see the progress that their child is making. We help them manage expectations and also learn to support their child. So parents, remember that you are not alone in this journey. You would want to establish your support system in supporting your child, whether it's a community group that shares resources or a trusted teacher, therapist, or psychologist who will hold your hand and walk this journey with you and your child. So there are some parents who are quite anxious, and I usually tell them, it's okay, we take this step by step. And I would share with them stories of ex-students and previous students who have gone before and the progress that they have made, just to give them that bit of hope. We're not pursuing perfection here. Reading development is not something where you can fix in a span of like 1 to 2 weeks. It's not an illness where you can cure. We want to let parents know that it's a journey, it's a process. It will take time, but you can get there.
Do you think sometimes the practical worries like cost sometimes may come in and sort of shake a parent's confidence in a sense, in terms of journeying with their child, since they know that this is going to be, as you mentioned, it is going to be a journey that would take maybe years rather than weeks?
Definitely the cost is a big factor, and usually in my consultations with parents, I'm very upfront with them. I will let them know the shortest time I've worked with a child is, for example, this period of time, but some clients stay with me for years, really years, simply because the demands of the curriculum keeps increasing, right, as they grow older. And it's like they're catching a train that never stops.
Right.
And this train gets faster and faster, and they're just trying to catch and close that gap. So we're constantly trying to close the gap. So a lot of clients actually stay with me because once we get to a certain point, maybe it's a bit comfortable, suddenly they go to the next level, right? And then they're uncomfortable again. And we find ways to help them cope again. So I would say, yes, cost is a big factor, but I also tell parents that there are group intervention programs around. For example, DAS Preschool Services, there's Care Corner. There's also the DSLS program by ECDA for K1s and K2s available, which is highly, highly subsidized. So I always tell parents, speak to your principal, your school principal, to your teachers, and see if this is available for your child. Because why not? If it's subsidized, go for that. And then on my side, let's see how I can try to support you.
It sounds like there is an ecosystem of support, if you like, that's available out there. And sometimes we just need to find the right door that opens to more options.
That's right. That's right.
Do parents come to you thinking that you are some form of a tuition center?
Oh, yes, they do. They do. And they will ask us, what's the difference between what you do and what's the difference between you and a tutor or a tuition teacher? So, I want to start by saying that I have a lot of respect for tuition teachers. I think there's a great need for them to support our kids on a more regular basis, because we know that intervention and therapy costs can be very high, can be very expensive. So there are times where we also tell parents that I think maybe why don't we stop therapy for a while and you find a home tutor who doesn't charge that high and is able to support your child on a more regular basis. So that's also one of the ways we help parents to manage the cost. We usually have to explain to parents what we do, that what we're trying to impart. We impart strategies, coping strategies, and we target certain difficulties. We don't do a lot of drilling. We don't do a lot of, exam papers. I don't give my student an exam paper and then after that say, okay, let me go through the answers with you. Even if I analyze the exam papers, I'm looking out for the gaps. I'm looking out for what is causing the child to not score in a certain component. And then we work on some of those underlying difficulties. So for example, if we know the components of the primary school paper, let's say we talk about the editing section. That's something that is very difficult for our children with dyslexia because it involves editing of grammar and spelling errors, right? So I might notice that, okay, this child at primary 6 is having difficulty with different word forms. So for example, the word sustain to sustenance. The spelling kind of changes, right? Your AI is no longer there. It changes to an E, and then you have your A and CE. So then I would target certain words with these changes. For example, curious to curiosity, because a lot of them would just write curious and put the ITY at the back, right? Without realizing that there's a certain change in spelling. So we do highlight some of these. For example, if we notice there's a gap in their spelling for this component.
Right. So it's targeted learning for the child. I'd like to focus actually a bit more on the topic of reading, which is kind of related to the editing skills that you mentioned. So from my observations, children tend to progress at reading at different rates. Some pick it up more quickly, others may take more time. This kind of raises the question, right? So what are some common myths about learning to read? And how can we tell the difference between genuine learning difficulty in reading and a child who's developing just at a slower pace?
Okay, let's talk about the common myths first. One of the common myths we have is that children will eventually pick up reading on their own. But the truth is, while speaking is natural to humans, reading is actually a learned skill. And our preschools are doing a great job weaving in phonics in their literacy teaching. So many of our learners seem to be able to pick up reading on their own. But it's not that they're picking up on their own, they're actually being taught. But those with a learning difficulty or reading difficulty might need more explicit instruction to learn just how our language or alphabetic code work. Sometimes parents think that it's a very natural process, you just let it be, and as they grow older, they will eventually learn to read. But that's not the case. Reading is actually a learned skill, and we do need to teach them. Okay, another myth is that after some time at intervention, a child with a learning difficulty can get quote and unquote cured. So they take it as like an illness, right? That, you see a doctor, you get some medication, and then you get cured for it. But a learning difficulty is not an illness. Through therapy intervention, a child with learning difficulty can learn to cope and manage with his or her difficulties, but it doesn't mean that they go away. They just learn to manage it well. And how to tell the difference between a genuine difficulty with reading and a child who is developing at a slower pace. This can be hard to tell, especially for young children. We usually ask if the child has received any intervention for reading. If the child's difficulties seem persistent despite high quality and structured instruction for at least 6 months, it can be a red flag. And we usually see progress in a few months of intervention, even weeks. So we also observe the pace of progress that the child is making and how readily the child generalizes what is learned. So I can give an example with my own daughter. My second daughter is 5.5 years old, and late last year she started showing interest in reading. I usually believe in teaching them only when they start to show signs of interest. I don't force it on them, even though I know how to teach reading. But when they start to show interest, then I know that, okay, it's time, and then I start to teach them. But she had the misconception that reading was me reading to her and her repeating after me. Because I think that was what she was doing with the classmates in school, in class. So when I picked out a simple book for her to try to blend, to decode, she said, no, because my teacher has not read it with me yet. So I knew that she was keen to read, but did not know how. And there was some resistance getting her to unlearn those reading habits and relearn how to use her letter sounds and blending. But now she is always trying to blend words on her own. But a year ago, it would have been unclear if her inability to read right was due to a persistent difficulty, or was it just that she needed some explicit teaching to give her that boost. So at that point, to me, the option was just to give her the explicit guidance and see if she's able to apply and generalize her learning in order to rule out a possible reading difficulty. I remember telling my husband at that point that I have not ruled out that our child might have a reading difficulty, because she actually had a bit of difficulty activating and using her sounds. She would guess wildly, for a word. She would use context clues, except try to blend. But he said, no, I don't think so, because she speaks so well, she's so eloquent. But I think precisely because I've seen how children can be so eloquent, expressive, and that makes parents think that, no, cannot be, my child cannot have a learning difficulty,
Right.
That's why I was very vigilant when it came to this child. She has always been very eloquent for her age, so I wanted to see whether there was a gap between her eloquence and her ability to pick up reading. If I notice a gap in that learning, then it would be a red flag to me. Yeah, so of course, fortunately, after working with her explicitly for a while, I really worked quite intensively on her letter sound correspondence, on her blending and segmenting skills, and then she was able to apply what she was learning.
Thanks for sharing with us that story from real life, Don.
Yeah.
I think I picked up a few things, right? First of all, you mentioned this gap, being very mindful that even if your child is very eloquent and very sociable or confident with her speaking, it doesn't mean that you can rule out any kind of reading disability.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So I think that's really interesting, and that's probably something that we may tend to just overlook, right? Because cannot be lah, it doesn't seem to be, she has a problem there. So thanks for sharing that. I think it helps to make it more concrete, what you've been talking about all this time. And I'm also hearing that there are certain skills in reading. For example, you mentioned quite a bit about blending the letters, segmentation. I'm wondering if, I'm just an everyday parent and my child is starting to show interest in reading. Is there something that we should prioritize first? Where do we begin?
I always say that phonemic awareness is key. In fact, acquisition of phonemic awareness is highly predictive of success in learning to read. Phonemic awareness is the ability to recognize and work with individual sounds of our language. For example, the word sheep has 5 letters, right? S-H-E-E-P. But it only has 3 phonemes, 3 individual sounds. The sh, e, p sounds. And we really should be teaching children to recognize sounds or phonemes and not letters or the whole word. Because research has shown that we do not read in pictorial form for English. Our brain actually decodes every single word that we are reading. So the 3 most important phonemic awareness skills is actually to develop the blending, segmenting, and manipulation processes. So blending is simply putting sounds together. For example, k, a, t. What do you get? Cat, right? And segmenting is if I give you a word like cat, what are the sounds? We would break it up to k, at, kind of like the opposite of blending. And manipulation is a way of like playing with sounds, like sound swapping. If I give you a word cat and I ask you, what do I need to change for the word to become mat? Which sound changes? And the child should be able to pick up that the first sound changes, right? And it changes to a and they pick out the sound. So these are the 3 most important phonemic awareness skills that we should be targeting.
Thanks for that. Hearing you just speak it out makes it feel a bit like fun and like a game. So I can imagine that young kids might actually enjoy this process.
Yeah, we do a lot of this kind of work with young children.
Thank you so much, Dawn. I think I've learned a lot just by hearing you share about your experience working with children with learning differences. I'm wondering, before we let you go, do you have any parting words of advice for parents out there who might be a little bit anxious?
Parents, trust your instincts. If you feel your child is in need of support, reach out, even if others have brushed off your concerns. Many children can mask their difficulties to some extent. Early intervention and early identification are really important and can have very encouraging results.
Thank you once again.
Thank you, June.
I'm sure you picked up some tips about learning difficulties as well as reading skills from today's episode. For more parenting resources, do visit our website at family.org.sg. And that's all we have for today. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. And do keep tuning in to the ParentNet podcast to learn and grow in your parenting journey.